Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraad on Capitalism Hits Home, an interpersonal update. This is a show about the intersection of capitalism, class, and our personal lives. Now we will continue with part 2, talking about what's happening to children now that Corona has struck our nation. And also, I will summarize at the end of this 2-part series with a discussion of how it could be, what we need not to be in the terrible situation that we're all in right now. Here is part 2. COVID and being at home for children, of course, means various things for different age children. For the littlest children, it means being home and often neglected. If a woman is single and has to work, the child can be left alone or left alone with siblings who really have no interest in taking care of a child. And so they can be left in wet diapers, unfed and howling. Children of preschool age who need to run around and who have mobility but no sense have to be watched all the time. And for women who had help from their relatives, that's often impossible now. As people shelter in place, their mother can't come over and help with the kids. Neither can their friends. Their friends can't come over with their kids because that's dangerous. And so children are very badly neglected and also they're endangered because their mothers who are working, and many more, as I said, many more women are unemployed in this capitalist recession than the last one, which was mainly men who were unemployed. But those women who are working even if in minimum wage, quote, essential jobs for which they're not properly paid, often have children. So that those children are neglected. And depending on how old they are, they can suffer more or less. Kids starting in middle school start to want and need to be with their friends because they're making a transition from their friend group, from their parents to their friend group, because their friend group are their future. And that future leaning starts in middle school and then continues. You could see me moving around because I want to be centered and I'm not succeeding. But in any case, that's a terrible privation for children. And children who are living in a place with a yard can at least run around and be distant from friends they can see next door or friends who come over when their mother's not home and they're not allowed to, but they do it anyway. But the older kids get, the more terrible it is to be trapped with parents. Even if they're good parents, children developmentally need to be with people their own age, to be with their peers or kids a little older or younger, but to be with older children and start transferring their needs and their sense of connection to other children. Plus, most adults don't really see children as people. They manage children. A lot of parents treat children as if, they're background music, they're there in the background, but not really sentient beings. It's in other children's eyes that children are recognized. And That's really important for children. I remember once having a little client who was in therapy with me who crawled in my lap at one point. She was 5 years old. She looked up at me and she said, "Are you sure you're really a grown-up?" It was hard for her to believe that somebody would play with her and see her and help her talk about her own pain if they were a grown-up. So the children get that interpersonal recognition from one another, and that is taken away in COVID. Children who have the most emotional disturbances are children who are either badly abused or children from military families who travel from base to base, who can never make friendships, and therefore who are not recognized as fully human in the eyes of their peers, which is the way children get recognition. So this is devastating for children. Another devastating thing is that children have to count on their parents to teach them, and they're already sick of their parents. Particularly older children are sick of their parents. I remember one little girl saying to me, "Wait a minute," because she was very angry at her mother, even though her mother seemed like a perfectly reasonable person. She didn't want to learn from her mother. She said, "School is where you learn. That's for the location. Home is not the location for learning. I'm not doing it." And a lot of mothers are so put upon, if their kid doesn't want to do it, forget it. And so that a whole group of children are missing skills they'll need for their whole lives. Of course, that's different with children of the upper class who have a governess living there. A nanny who will take care of them during the day or take care of them day and night, depending on the parents. But for the mass of children, they're missing out on education. Private schools have a much more elaborate and much, much better program for helping children learn, much better computer programs, much more inventive, much more captivating, much more worked on. And private school children have their own computers. So they have the computer savvy that many public school children lack. And so that educationally, children are terribly hurt. In addition, there's the whole problem of child abuse. During COVID, there are fewer reports of child abuse because the people who do the reporting are overwhelmingly teachers, school nurses, neighbors who see the children's bruises because their children are playing with those children, and other people outside of the household. However, many more children are terribly abused because their abuse is only seen when they go to the emergency room, and it's severe. It's so severe that their parents had to take them to the emergency room. 81% of children who are murdered at home. And so the likelihood for child abuse and child homicide is far greater at home. So children are not only educationally endangered and developmentally endangered and mentally endangered, they're also physically endangered, and they can't run away. Child abuse becomes much less pronounced at age 6 because children can run and because they are uniformly out of the house for many hours a day at school. Well, here they're not out of the house at all, and they don't have any recourse. And so it's a dangerous situation for children. The last part of this 2-part podcast that I want to give is, what could we do about it? Why are we in these dire straits? but also more importantly, what could we do to get out of them? What are other countries doing? Well, other countries are keeping their people safe. They have leaders who've taken charge, whether they're small places like Taiwan, less developed places like China and Vietnam, or developed places, wealthy nations like the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, Finland, who have had, Sweden had originally some cases, so they realized they made a mistake and they had to shelter in place a lot more and do more testing and treating. Now they've gotten it under control. All the other developed nations have gotten it under control. There's a graph that goes way up that shows the progress of corona across many, many countries. However, you can see all the other developed countries have gone way, way down. We haven't. We're still right up there and unprotected. And the chain of lack of protection goes down, down from the parents to the children, who are the least protected of all. In a country like Iceland, where they've had no cases, they have special distancing at their child care centers, which are everywhere, very nicely. They have counselors. They use nurses and counselors to go and visit families to help them. In child care centers, they have precautions, but children usually are not carriers, and so that they can go to child care centers. United States child care centers are COVID intense. Both the daycare personnel and the children get COVID. Even though children have died, they don't usually get the kind of severe symptoms and death even that adults get. But that children are left abandoned at home, and they don't have to be. We have all these unemployed people. They could be hazmated up and go visit door to door and help children. We could have specially safe child care centers for all those little children who are suffering and whose parents don't have the money for the nanny or the governess. We could do what every other advanced nation does. We could give people, the government could guarantee that every person got between 70 and 90% of their salary, whether they were working or not, and they would pay that salary as long as the business owner or whoever it was for whom they were working refused to lay anyone off. Therefore, their people can go out and shop. They don't have 1 in 4 children now who is hungry because their parents can afford food. They have providers going around. There's a lot of unemployed people to do testing and tracking and treating, and they utilize them. And so that they don't suffer the way we do. Our country is a failed state that fails to maintain the health of its citizens. In the beginning of the pandemic, Trump knew about it. He knew about it as of January 2020. Well, he first knew December 2019, but decided to keep it quiet because it might affect the stock market, which he took credit for raising. He also, once the pandemic started to spread, he sold our emergency pandemic equipment. The receipts have been held up by courageous congresspeople, progressives, and refused to have a national program. And so he consigned us all to COVID or to exposure because of the states competing against each other for supplies. A mask, according to Cuomo, a mask that used to be 50 cents is now $5. So states who are already strapped for money because they're not going to get some of the tax money that they used to have, are having to compete for equipment. And because our healthcare system is a private, market-driven healthcare system, it's not available to masses of people. There was an article in the New York Times 2 days ago how you're much more likely to live if you're in a hospital for the wealthy than if you're in a hospital for the poor, where you may die gasping for breath without a ventilator. So that the class-divided, market-driven healthcare system means that people are really sentenced to death. We also have prisons where people are not protected and are sentenced to death in crowded prisons. We have army vessels where people are sentenced to death, as they were in that ship whose captain refused. He refused to not let his people off the ship and was therefore disciplined, and Trump wanted to fire him. So that we are left frightened, without recourse, needing to buy our own protective supplies, being endangered, and we are also the only nation in the developed world that has its president decrying science, although now Trump says, I always recommended masks, even though I never did till this week, but whatever. We're the only nation that has a whole group of people feeling they are fighting for liberty when they don't protect themselves or anybody around them. No one else has that outlaw element that expresses itself that way, following the president example, who doesn't even wear a mask. And so Americans are all in bad shape, men, women, and children. And what makes it even more painful for all of us, as we express our pain in different ways, from the most extreme, which is a masculine form, mass shootings, and shootings at home, and so on, to the more passive forms like taking drugs or taking it out on your children, we're in trouble because we're all frightened. We're all unprotected. And that isn't a fantasy. We can't say it's just in your head. It's not. I mean, I have a podcast with Max Golding called It's Not Just in Your Head. Because even though I'm a hypnotherapist and also a mental health counselor, I can see that the problems and the terrible anxiety people have now, and fear and depression, is not just in their heads. They're in a terrible situation, objectively, and have to learn how to cope with it. One way to learn, of course, for our government interested, would be to learn from the entire developed world, who are our allies, who have all gotten COVID down, whether it's Singapore or Taiwan, small countries, or Iceland or Finland, who don't have a big population, or China, which has the biggest population in the world. They've all managed. Now, sometimes they'll have a resurgence. For example, China had a resurgence. They had some cases in Beijing. They closed down the airports. New York hasn't closed down any airports, and people are flying in from Florida, where they just came from being jammed in with other people without any protection, or Oklahoma, in case they are the few who went to Trump's rally. They all can fly into New York because our governor does not want to close the airports to protect us, because tourism and business are big revenue streams, even though France closed the airports, and so did every other European nation. And because we are the pariah nation, Americans are now not allowed into many countries. We're not allowed into Canada. We're not allowed into France or other European countries because we're endangered, and we will endanger their citizens because we are objectively endangered. And everyone is afraid or is repressing a perfectly reasonable fear that we will suffer or die. And that's true of married men, of single men, of married women, of single women, and of children who will die, who are probably less likely to die from COVID than they are from child abuse, as people degenerate into rage to cover up their vulnerability and their pain. What's exciting is, it turns out from the CDC studies that demonstrations do not increase, demonstrations where everyone is masked. Sometimes the police have pulled down people's masks while they pepper spray them, but luckily that's not a mass phenomenon. But that, except for the danger from the police, one doesn't get endangered from demonstrations. They've done studies of the density of COVID before and after demonstrations, and they found that COVID is not dangerous for demonstrators. Unfortunately, we do have an increasing number of Americans who are waking up and saying, why am I a capitalist? I have no capital. Very few people do. I am suffering. I don't want a market-driven healthcare system. I want Medicare for all. I want every life-saving basic service to be endorsed by the government. And of course, a sensible program would be that housing, which is crucial, shelter, healthy food, because food is essential, clean air, which is essential, clean water, which is essential, temperature regulation, like air conditioning in the summer if it's terribly hot, or heat in the winter if it's terribly cold, an opportunity for some exercise like safe parks and places to go, elder care, which is necessary for life, early child care, which is necessary for life, after school care, which is necessary for life, be all government services. Because the people who have gotten COVID the most are the poorest people in the United States, because they have much less access to healthy organic food. And as we know, pesticides are not healthy. Canned food, which is saturated with salt, is less healthy than fresh food, which is a lot more expensive. Go to the farmer's market, you'll be surprised at the cost. Clean air, which is much more possible if you don't live near the incinerator. Incinerators are placed near poor neighborhoods, nor the atomic reactor. Clean water, which in 28 cities is not provided, so that people can get contaminated from drinking the city water. Shelter, support for where people live. Medicine, which we need to live. All of those things that I mentioned should be provided by a responsible government to keep all of its citizens healthy and alive. And as most of us don't have any capital, capitalism, where you have to make a profit from everything, just isn't going to work for us. You shouldn't have to make a profit from the basic needs of life. That's bizarre and unhealthy and inhumane. And we should protect the life, the liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all of our citizens, as the Constitution says. Because what has happened is that being poor often results in being economically poor, often results in a death sentence. It's a cruel and unusual punishment banned by our Constitution. And so the way our country has handled COVID is kind of like the negative model, the lighthouse, showing a light on where we should never go because it's dangerous. It says danger, danger. And instead, those of us who don't have capital, which is most of us, who live off of our labor rather than our held assets, have to get together and make sure we can live. Because COVID brings it all home. Of course, there's no money in keeping pandemic supplies because they don't turn over. You don't get any money. So they didn't do it. Capitalism, which is most out of control in the United States. Even though Germany's capitalist, they won't allow that. When Trump tried to buy up all the potential vaccines from a German company and have them all for Americans, they said, look, capitalism has limits. And it has limits because Germany has a very, very powerful socialist party and communist party as well. And they're unionized in socialist and communist unions that feel like workers should control it all. But for the moment, we're going to stand up for the workers in the gas industry or the transport workers or whatever. And the same in France, which is a capitalist country. But left organizations prevent Macron from pulling what Trump did. Even England, which is very much contaminated by the American example, has public health care and a demand to maintain it, but you shouldn't have to make a profit off of people's health. And so, to summarize, I want to say that the coronavirus has struck home. It has struck and distorted and disturbed the lives of men, whether single or married, of women, whether single or married, and particularly of children, because it's been handled in a capitalist way, with a capitalist, market-driven healthcare system, and without protection from our citizens and for our citizens to protect themselves from contamination. This is a tragedy, and more Americans are realizing that this is a tragic, terrible way to run a society, that those who have no capital should not be supporting capitalism. We need a socialism here, and we need it really badly. And coronavirus has hit it home. That's all for today. Thank you for listening. This episode has been brought to you by Democracy at Work. Please support our work. Visit our website at democracyatwork.info.